Okay, this is going to be probably a bit of a shorter video, would be my guess. But I wanted to talk about what a sort of rationalization that I came to that I'm still kind of pondering on, which may not be the best time to make a video, but what the hell? It'll help me organize my thoughts and maybe get this out there. Because as an aspiring writer, and particularly a white male aspiring writer, I have seen a lot of articles lately over the past year or more about the challenges that white males face in the publishing industry. And certainly I feel like I face some of my own challenges, but there's a lot of debate on whether or not this is a real issue or not. And rather than specifically take a side as to whether or not there is this sort of white male literary crisis, I tend to like to think of things more in terms of systems and incentives and how we sort of end up at these crossroads where I want to give people the benefit of the doubt. I don't want to think that, broadly speaking, there are malicious people, but I don't think most people are malicious, which means that when you get conversations like these, you get a lot of people who are speaking passionately about something that they care about, who genuinely feel like they are the victims, being wronged in some way. And it's not that they're bad people because they don't see, maybe there's more to the situation or whatever. It's that maybe there's some sort of breakdown in communication. And I think something that really clicked recently is I think there's a failure in terms of the word equality. Because really, when it comes down to the core of a lot of these discussions, it is a question of what it means to be equal in publishing. And this ties back for me into something that I think of, and this is going to be a bit tangential, but it'll tie back in, I promise, as the paradox of democracy. And maybe this is somebody else's wording, I don't know. Because the first thing that made me really appreciate this was back in college in a sustainability class, our teacher told us a story, and it's a story about a true town. So, since I don't remember the details literally, I can tell you that it's true, but I'm going to tell a simplified version of the story because I don't remember the exact details. I just remember the thrust of it, which is this. Essentially, there was a river, and along their river there were, let's say, 5 towns. And the farther down the river you went, the less affluent the population became, the sort of cheaper, more underprivileged they became. And what would happen is people would send their garbage down the river. And each town would send their garbage down the river, where ultimately at the base of the river, at this 5th town, it would all congregate and just make this huge, huge mess for the people in this town at the bottom of the river, who were mostly minorities, blacks, and so forth. But here's the thing. Every time they tried to have a meeting to vote on whether or not we should do something about this, naturally your small town got outvoted 4-5. Should we do something? All in favor of doing something, raise your hand. 1 person raises their hand. All in favor of leaving it as it is, 4 people raise their hand. And this is basically populist democracy. And this is one of the pitfalls of populist democracy, is if everything is okay for 80% of people, but things are very obviously unfair towards the remaining 20%, then can you really be said to be being democratic if you're just completely overriding the fact that things are bad for those 20% of people? That is not what we would consider ethical. But at the same time, if you have it the other way around, and this is in the story, eventually what did happen is that they changed things and the 20% was able to have a proper say and things changed, whatever. But the point is, if you do change things, then what ends up happening is you can end up having a sort of rule by minority where the 80% has to bend the knee to what 20% of people want. And, in the case of this sort of story on the river, obviously that would be what most people would consider ethically right. But we can think of plenty of examples throughout history where a relative minority has been able to rule with, use their opinions, their needs, their philosophies to override what would otherwise be the majority. And this is the paradox of democracy. It sounds, democracy sounds good. Everybody gets a vote. But if everybody gets just one vote, then it becomes very easy for privileged groups and underprivileged groups to form, and for the privileged groups to override the underprivileged groups because they have no reason to change. At the same time, if you give uneven voting rights, then again, what happens is the same thing. You just have usually smaller privileged groups overriding the whole. And this is the paradox of democracy, is finding that balance of really giving everybody a fair and proper voice. And bringing this back into equality in publishing, I am appreciating now that equality is the same paradoxical word where ethically it's what we all strive for, but realistically and definitionally, it's not necessarily truly achievable in that way. So even just breaking this down, and again, I'm approaching this from a charitable perspective, where when somebody says that they want equity in publishing and they think that we need more white male writers, they're not being racist or bigoted or prejudiced. They genuinely believe that this is what is right and good. Just like somebody who is saying that this is equality is also, approaching it from a good faith perspective. And there are ways of understanding their versions of equality in good faith. So I want to break down some of these sort of good faith interpretations of equality in publishing and how there are pros and cons to each of them. And much like the paradox of democracy, there's not really a great answer at the end of the day. So let's get into it. So first of all, let's talk about just straight up equality by the numbers, which means, this is the most basic form of equality you can imagine, that says that if we publish 100 books, 50 of them have to be by men, 50 of them have to be by women, 20 of them have to be by white, 20 of them by black, 20 of them by Mexican, 20 of them by Asian, which Asian American is like the fact that you're clumping so many different Asian cultures into one thing, which I guess maybe you even do with blacks. To be honest, I'm not super well versed in terms of that particular aspect, to be fair. Just admitting my own ignorance there. But the point is, just this sort of very strict numerical division where if you just look at it in a book, it's quote-unquote fair. The sort of DEI affirmative action of publishing. And the problem with this is, first of all, it doesn't really reflect reality in a lot of ways. And, just because you have 50, books written by men or 50 books written by women doesn't necessarily mean that your population is evenly split 50-50 men and women, or that the people who buy books are split 50-50 men and women, or that, the type of people who read the books are a certain race or gender or identity, either in terms of how it's selling, in terms of the people writing. And it also creates situations where rather than pursuing work that is really based off of quality of the work and what it's saying, and I understand quality is subjective, but again, please bear with me in terms of, trying to good faith here. The quality of the work is subjective. So let's say you have published your 50th book by a woman, and you've published 49 books by a man, and that says that the next book needs to be published by a man, but there's this really, really amazing piece of work that is right on point that was written by a woman, and you can't publish it because you just haven't yet met the quota of the male book. So first you gotta, publish that next male book, which I'm saying there's a difference of 1, but let's say the difference is like 10 or whatever. Or, you just happen to be having an issue like, let's say politically, like the overturning of Roe v. Wade, where you have a lot of women writing passionately about this. And so there's so many books being written by women that are relevant and pertinent to the situation, and they're of good quality. Not being able to ride that zeitgeist is counter to the sort of idea of art, and especially when all you're doing is trying to meet some quota. It functionally puts the numbers and the identity more forward than anything else I can think of. Like, literally everything becomes about your identity. It's the complete consumption of identity politics into everything, where the quality of the work is irrelevant. All that matters is who wrote it. So that's kind of a few of the downfalls of that particular type. So let's move on to what I would call like the sort of second type of equality, which is what I kind of think of, which I see a lot, which is the sort of equality in a capitalist sense, or a sort of business equality, where you look at the market, and if you say, like, right now more women are buying books and reading than men, especially in the realm of fiction. This is sort of, it's an undeniable fact, and while you can debate the sort of degree to which it's happening, it is just happening. And so consequently, you will see more books published by women than you will see by men, since more women tend to read. I don't think it's any challenge to say that genders tend to prefer, not to say that they exclusively read that, but they tend to prefer things written by their own gender. That's fine. It's normal. Just like it's normal then that consequently most books would be written by that sort of particular people. And in that sense, having a market that then is predominantly written, primarily authored by women, would be seen equal in a way that it is reflective of the sales. And this is certainly, I think, a more fair version than the sort of by the numbers version. But I think it still has, because, it does tend to at least align more with the fact that everything is not perfectly equal. And given the sort of unfortunate realities of the business side of publishing, does at least take that into consideration. It's a more realistic way of looking at things, even if it's not quite as idealistic. But the sort of pitfall that I see with it, and this is what I see a lot with modern books right now, is that it's appealing to a market that already exists and doesn't leave a whole lot of room for breaking into other markets or of drawing new people in. And this isn't, when I'm talking about this, I'm not saying that this is being pursued in the name of equality. I think a lot of it realistically, what we're seeing is just people not wanting to take risky business ventures, people not wanting to accept the risk of making something different, of trying to appeal to markets outside of the people that already read. Especially, because you're not just seeing it in books, you're seeing it in music, you're seeing it in games, you're seeing it in movies. This sort of consolidation of most big name things around a few very profitable titles, while the majority of other stuff gets sort of shunted to the side. And while, like I said, this is primarily, I think, more to do with the lack of desire in pursuing business, it is functionally still another form of equality in terms of discussing, what does it mean to be equal? And like I said, I've seen a lot of people sort of in this debate about, is there a male literary crisis, using this argument to say that, well, it's not a problem if more women are buying books than men. But then, like I said, the question becomes, is it proportional? And secondly, just because there aren't as many men reading books, does that mean that there shouldn't be more effort made to get men reading books, rather than necessarily just, appealing to the same narrow markets over and over and over? And, in publishing, this happens to be an issue with men not reading. But like I said, every other industry pretty much has this problem of trying to appeal to the same, of too many companies trying to appeal to the same small niche, rather than trying to break out and discover new markets. So that's another kind of equality. There's another more, I would say, idealistic form of equality that would be kind of by numbers proportional to population. So if what I said with the first example was, you don't necessarily have, 1/5, 20% whites, 20% blacks, 20% Mexicans, 20%, like these sort of really neat divides amongst populations, then maybe we should instead, try to realign it to sort of census data so that, if your population is 29.5% white, then 29.5% of your published books should be by white people. And if 15% of the population is black, then 15% of your books should be published by black people, and so on and so forth, which is probably more, by my perspective, in a way, it's more realistically fair than the first one. But, like, even just talking about it feels kind of absurd. Like, I guess there is a sense, very, very statistically, of it being a representational form of things. But again, like, sometimes certain issues aren't necessarily equal, and sometimes certain voices and certain times call for a flexibility in this thing. Like, I mentioned Roe v. Wade and how that would cause a furor of female writers to be writing about the sort of female experience. And it's the same with various minority groups, depending on what's going on. And, art is inherently political, especially good art, because it's designed to challenge you. It's designed to make you think. It's designed to make you talk. So if you're keeping to this sort of rigidly structured system by being proportional to population, then you're kind of ignoring the elements that make up the stories that these people are telling, and you're really limiting those particular voices. Not only that, you kind of come back to the same problem I mentioned at the beginning with the rivers, where you're one city at the bottom of the river by virtue of being just one city is going to have representationally less opportunity to have their voices heard. And, it would be the same way with whatever your smallest population group is. They're going to have very, very few chances to get their message out there, or, be limited in their perspective. And then the sort of final version of equality that I want to bring up that I see a lot is the idea of a sort of historical equality, where because men, and particularly white men, have been the dominant force in tradition or in publishing for so long, because that has been the tradition, that it is now necessary to sort of overcorrect implies a bias, but it is now necessary to sort of balance out the record by sort of excluding those voices and bringing the previously muted. I'm going to use the word muted because I can't remember the word that I actually want, but bringing those voices up and lifting them and elevating them to the detriment of the sort of the straight white male author. So it's this sort of idea that it's not just equality in looking at it from a present point of view, but also taking in the historical aspect. And again, like, in terms of the prose, there absolutely needs to be an understanding of history in these sort of conversations. And there's nothing wrong, because, again, art should be challenging. So if you're just getting the same things that you've already been told, then there's no reason not to be getting new voices. I mean, I'm somebody who believes that sometimes, pretty much every story has already been told. What matters is how it's told. You can read Gatsby, and Gatsby is pretty much as relevant today as it was in the 1920s, 100 years later. So the question is, why do we still have stories like Gatsby? Well, because those issues still persist. The question is, do we need another version of Gatsby told from somebody of the same socioeconomic class and identity as Gatsby, or is there not more benefit to be gained from getting a new perspective on that type of story? So the pro is definitely there insofar as there is a sort of historical context for that. The con is that the new voices are new people, and the old voices are old people. So the people who are speaking up now aren't necessarily the same people with the same problems as those who were ignored in the past. And likewise, a lot of the new challenges that sort of straight white males face in the modern political climate are not the same as what they faced years ago, particularly because there has been this massive shift. And in sort of not robbing, but in sort of denying them an outlet to explore this sort of shift, and in their station, you end up denying them a place to share their experiences, much like you denied the people in the past, which is sort of the ethical question. Is just because something, we recognize that it was a problem in the past, but is then silencing a voice in the past, today, acceptable because of what happened in the past? Do two wrongs make a right in this situation? And I've already clearly passed some of my judgment insofar as, like I said, you are denying these sort of white males a chance to speak to their current conditions. But to bring it back to a more strictly neutral view, I'm not here to sort of say, two wrongs don't make a right, because I don't think that things are that simple. And that's really the thrust of this whole video, is the conversation is around equality. And I think that the majority of people genuinely want to see a more equitable publishing industry, a more equitable artistic industry. If I may just inject something extremely opinionated, I only read translated works because I'm not necessarily interested in the African American perspective or the Asian American perspective or, the European American perspective. What I want to fucking read are the African perspective, the Asian perspective, the European perspective. I want more global opinions than just everything being centered around America. So that's what I want to see more of, not just, X ethnicity America, and that being sort of the stand-in of, well, we represent Asian culture because we have an Asian American writer writing about it. No, they're writing about the Asian American experience, not necessarily the experience living in Asia. And I think that there's a lot to be learned from both. And it frustrates me to see sort of translations, on the one hand, picking up, but on the other hand, being really left out in this conversation. But that's my personal perspective. Just to, again, offer even another twist in the question of equality, in the question of what makes something equal. So there are bad actors, there are biased people, but I do not believe that they make up the majority. I do not want to suggest that they make up the majority. I believe that the majority of people are genuinely at their core trying to be decent people, but there are things in our discussion, our language, the way we communicate, that we often overlook and we don't think about because we're not used to examining our languages, our modes of communication, and the sort of complexities that go into that. So next time you sort of see these conversations, I hope you can think about it and gain something out of it, like I really have in some of these conversations, that when I get really frustrated with people, when I want to strangle people, I can kind of think okay, well, maybe what this isn't necessarily them being a bad person or me being a bad person. It's two people with different ideas, not necessarily communicating on the same level. And if we were able to sort of adjust our levels, we might be able to find more common ground than we thought we previously had. So that's my thought for the week, and have a good one.